So welcome everybody. We have with us obviously Peter Liljedahl, author of Building Thinking Classrooms, and the other people that you see on the screen are some of the admin team. I'm Don Newman. I'm a math teacher in Baltimore, Maryland. We have Abby Bates, who is actually the founder of the group, and she teaches math in California. Dana Carey is a math teacher in Indiana, and Patty Britton and Monica Harrell are math teachers in Texas. So that's our group. And we just wanted to say that, again, we're very grateful to have Peter here. And we try to keep the focus strictly on building thinking classrooms in this group. And I think it's worked very well so far. And, we have an opportunity to have the author of the book that is the sole purpose of our Facebook group here. And we're so appreciative of Peter, donating his time to do that. And so we have, we took a look at the poll results, and we're going to have a series of topics and questions to ask Peter to address that were based on those poll results. The top vote getters are things we're going to cover, and then if there's time remaining, we'll take other comments and questions and ask Peter those as well. So, Abby, you want to do yours?
Yeah, let's jump right in, Peter, if you're up for that.
I'm up for it.
All right, so one of the most common questions that we get in our group is about thin slicing. And so we kind of wanted to start with that. Most of the questions that we get center around like, what's the best way to thin slice a lesson? Or are there certain strategies that you have seen that are very effective in sequencing a series of problems or any other tips that you have regarding that?
Okay, great question. Of course, this is a big idea. But before I answer that, I just want to say that I am just so appreciative of the admin group here and of everybody who participates in this. I think that this sort of this bootstrapping that teachers are doing nowadays to grow professionally and using their own time and their own resources to do so, I think it just speaks volumes to how professional teachers are as a whole. All right, so thin slicing, and when you're reading the book, this was a chapter I couldn't wait to get to, and I think you see this as you're reading the book, because I don't know how many call outs there are to chapter 9 before you get to chapter 9, but it's like, finally we're here. We can talk about this is where we take all of these ideas. This is where we take all this culture that we've been building in the first 8 chapters, building this thinking classroom culture, and then point it at content. And this is important because we have stuff we got to get through, right? Like, we have things we have to teach, and it's really about how do we vector this culture at content in such a way that we can actually make back some of the time that we've invested and start to see some of the impacts. So I call it thin slicing. We could have called it a lot of different things, but for those of you who are just new to the group, what this is about is how do we sequence a set of tasks so that students with very small amounts of prior knowledge, maybe it's old knowledge, maybe it's a bit of direct instruction that happens at the beginning of a lesson, that they can start to move through content and figure things out on their own. And I draw heavily on variation theory for this, and the idea that when we're moving from one task to another, we want to try to vary only one thing, right? So students don't notice, sometimes they don't notice a pattern until you change something. But if you change too many things at once, then they can't notice what's staying the same, and it's this sort of thinking. That's all up in the clouds, but now let's get down on the rubber, get the rubber on the road here. So fundamentally, what we have to think about is that a thin slicing sequence is really just a mathematically logical progression through a series of tasks. And let's not overthink that, right? Like you can think about it as going from easy to hard. You can think of it as a starting point and going to a finishing point, but it's really just a mathematically logical sequence. That's number one. Number two, and to be clear on that, like we work with this all the time as teachers, right? We teach students how to add fractions with common denominators before we teach them to add fractions with different denominators, right? Like there's a progression here, and that's all this is. But that's not to say that it's always smooth, okay? So there are sometimes, to go from A to B, you're not always going to get this perfectly smooth curve of progression. You're going to hit these snag points where all of a sudden everybody is stuck at a point, and you got to be ready for that. And you got to be willing to step in and say, okay, so here's a hint that can help you get over that hurdle, and so on and so forth. So for example, if we're working on completing the square, all of a sudden when the quadratic term or the square term has a leading coefficient, the gain changes a little, right? Or if well, I can think of, if you push me, I'll come up with more examples. But how to create them? So there's a couple of rules that I follow when I create them that might help you. Rule number one, you can never start too easy, right? And if you've read chapter 9, you think, okay, well, if we start too easy, though, then we run the risk of the students being bored. That is true. But if you start too hard, you run the risk of them starting out frustrated. And it's really hard to recover from frustration. It's much easier to recover from boredom. All you have to do is increase the challenge, right? You can never start too easy. And sometimes what that means is we're going to start in the middle of yesterday's lesson or the middle of last year's unit. So because curriculum naturally spirals, there's always something that comes before. Don't be afraid to start in the middle of that, because if you estimate incorrectly and where you started was too easy, you can always skip questions when you go to give the next question. All right. So that's hint number one. You can never start too easy. Hint number two is never be afraid to have the changes microscopic, right? Like we're going to, like in the book, I give the example of a factoring quadratic, and all of a sudden we go from a single digit constant term to a double digit. Now you'd think that really doesn't make a difference, right? It's still just, we're still looking for factors and so on and so forth. But the psychology of students is fascinating, and there's a lot of things that happen for them. So never be afraid to add more layers in between your slices to make them extra thin, because again, the consequences are that maybe I'll just, okay, I added 3 questions here, but I realize I can just skip to number 4 right away. Over plan is the third hint. And this happened to us over and over and over again. Was we'd look at a class, we'd say, okay, let's create a thin slice sequence. We think they'll get through this much. And then the whole class shoots through that in 8 minutes. And we're like, now we're scrambling and on our feet trying to come up with more tasks. And if we're adding 2-digit numbers, for multiplying fractions, that's not hard to do. But for some topics, this is really hard to do because you have to make sure that things are actually solvable and so on and so forth. So over plan, over prepare, right? So don't be afraid to start too low. Don't be afraid to go too far, and don't be afraid to have too much density, okay? Because the consequences are, the worst consequences that you have to skip, and you might not get through it all, but that's okay, because now you got your sequence for tomorrow, right? So don't be afraid to over plan that way. So those are the first 3 principles that I follow. The next one is try to anticipate where there's going to be a traffic jam, right? Just because you have a sequence of tasks doesn't mean they're going to move through smoothly. So I'll give you an example. I was working with a group of teachers, and we were working on thin slicing for having students simplify radical expressions, right? Extracting perfect squares and so on. And we had a simplify square root of 800. And at first we didn't anticipate that this was going to be a sticky spot. We thought that that's really not that different from simplifying square root of 98 or something like that. But when they hit that one, they started to reveal to us misunderstandings that we hadn't anticipated. So sometimes there are sticking points that we can anticipate, but we also have to be vigilant that things can grind to a halt in ways that we didn't expect. Okay, but try to anticipate where those sticky points are and then pay attention to it. So you can see that a group is heading for that now. And am I going to have to intervene or am I not? Can I just keep them going, right? Like if I'm doing subtraction of 3-digit numbers and I'm asking them to regroup or decompose multiple times, that could be a sticking point, right? So being aware of where those possible sticking points are so that you can anticipate, you can pay attention to when groups get close to it, then you're ready to give an intervention if necessary. And the next piece of advice is it's okay if your sequence is not perfect. And this is a one that I think is sort of a take it on faith one, but it's when we're first building a thinking classroom, when we're first building a culture of a thinking classroom, the sequence is really important, right? And we want it to get progressively harder. And the reason it's so important is because when we're starting out, students have no patience and no perseverance, right? And what I mean by that is that they're not willing to keep working at something if the challenge exceeds their ability, and they're not willing to keep working on something if their ability exceeds their challenge. They just have no patience, they have no perseverance. But the more they work in a thinking classroom, the thicker these patience and perseverance get. And there's images in chapter 9 to help you understand what I mean by that. But basically, the more they work at this, the more they learn to persevere and the more patience they have. And what that means is if your sequence is not perfect, it's okay. Their perseverance and their patience act as really powerful buffers for this. So other than that, I think people are so worried that it has to be so perfect. And that's what's paralyzing. It doesn't have to be. And let's not forget that you're still the teacher in the room and you have a lifetime of thinking on your feet and being reactive in situations. So when you see a group is just gobbling these up, you know you can skip them ahead. You can skip 3-4 questions. You see another group is really struggling, you can actually take a step back, or let's do a parallel question, and so on and so forth. And that's another thing I'll come back to in a minute. That you still need to be a teacher in the room, and you still need to be on your feet, and you still need to be reacting. So it doesn't all live or die by this sequence. The sequence is a tool that you bring into this lesson, just like any other tool that you bring in. And then you have to decide how to invoke that tool in the moment. And coming back to what I said about, it's always handy to have a couple of parallel questions as well, especially around sticking points, because if a group really struggles to get through something, rather than move them on, sometimes it's good to just keep them moving laterally and giving them something to really hone their understanding and their confidence before you increase the challenge. So I don't know if that kind of helped, but some really basic ones. Start easier than you think is necessary, go further than you think is necessary, have more density than you think is necessary, anticipate the sticking points, have some parallel questions, but more than anything else, be willing to improvise.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is very helpful. I know I've been trying to create my own, and I know many other teachers have been as well, so that's really helpful. And kind of as a follow-up to that, I'm sure you're aware that in the math curriculum world right now, we kind of seem to have curriculums that are on opposite ends of things, right? We have very task-based books, and then we also have very like traditional, here's your examples and 50 questions book. And so I know also there's been some discussion about, do you have any recommendations about, is it better to do like bigger open tasks or all thin slicing, or is there like a happy medium? Like there's been some discussion around that. We just thought we'd see if you had any tips or have seen anything as you've been doing your research around classrooms.
So the one thing I can say is you don't want to do thin slicing too early in the building of the culture, right? A whole bunch of things need to be in place for thin slicing to work really well. And one of them is the knowledge mobility. If knowledge mobility is really solidly in place, thin slicing goes easier for you, right? Because you got 8 to 10 groups, maybe 12 groups working at the whiteboards, You're trying to move through a series of thin sliced tasks with groups of students. Students are tearing through these at a pace of 3 to 4 minutes per task. You got 12 groups. There's no way you can keep up. You just cannot keep up. So knowledge mobility helps with that. Every time a group steals a question from another group, that's better. That helps you. Every time they seek help from each other, that helps you. So early in the school year, you want to use what I call thick slicing tasks, like tax collector is an example of thick slicing, right? Like it just moves slowly. And that's okay, because then you have time to really make sure everyone's staying in that flow zone and that balance between challenge and ability, because they don't have any patience or perseverance. As a culture gets richer and the knowledge mobility increases, they're more tolerant of you giving a task verbally and so on and so forth. It's easier and easier and easier to thin slice. Now, does that mean you should be thin slicing all the time? It depends on what the content you're trying to teach is. If it's a really skill-based one, thin slicing works really well. If it's really deep conceptual, then maybe you don't want to be thin slicing. So I'm thinking of the difference between factoring quadratics and graphing trig curves, right? Like graphing trig curves is a big animal. It's slow moving. It has lots of conceptual stuff, especially when we shift phase shifts and so on and so forth. It's better if the students are working on something that is moving slower. It's a bigger idea and so on and so forth. But as we're moving through these sort of like pattern extension at primary, it's a really nice way to do thin slicing. Where I was in a classroom just before Christmas and we had students working on arithmetic series, right? So like 2, 5, 8, ... And so their job was to continue the sequence and then figure out what the 10th one was, and then to write a rule for how to express this. And that was a perfect activity for thin slicing, right? Like it really set a pattern that they were able to organize their thinking around. So it really depends on the mathematics. I'm a huge fan of both sides, right? Pythagoras is an example. Like we can approach that as a thin slicing, which I give an example in the book, or we can approach it really conceptually and let's really explore it and so on and so forth. So there isn't any perfect formula for this. Think of it as a tool again.
Can you say that again, Peter? You froze for just a second. Think of what as a tool?
Think of your thinking classroom as a tool. And how are you going to leverage that tool for the content that you want to cover today, right? Do you want them to work really digging deep, or do you want them to just be moving through lots of examples?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to differentiate. So I appreciate you taking the time to address that. There was a question that came up on the live stream, just asking if there's any difference in thin slicing between elementary versus secondary and how they structure it.
I've never found a difference in it. I think both of them require you to be much more responsive. I find that when I go into elementary classrooms, I have to be way more nimble than when I'm in a high school classrooms. And there's just something about the students are more likely to get off script, so to speak, that their thinking goes in ways that isn't as predictable at primary level. And I think it's maybe because or at elementary level, there's just more ways to solve a problem that maybe doesn't go in the direction that we were expecting them to, right? There's just so many ways that students can come up with an answer that is different. So I'll give you an example. I was in an elementary classroom and we were doing an activity where what we were doing was they had to build numbers. So we were pulling cards for digits, and they had to build a 4-digit number that was as close to 5,000 as possible, for example. So the digits would come one at a time and so on. And then once they had their 4-digit number, they had to figure out how close they were to the target number. And if they were over 5,000, it was really easy to figure out how much over they were. But if they were under, and it was a little trickier and so on. And then we were picking target numbers that were very different. They weren't just like really nice, pretty numbers and so on. And what really was interesting to me was how the students, there was 8 groups of students, and when they came to finding the difference between their number and the target number, not a single group did subtraction. Right? And we were like, the teacher wasn't so surprised. I was surprised. Not a single group did subtraction. It was like they were willing to do 600 different things rather than subtraction. They were all finding the difference, but subtraction was like a no-go territory, right? So it's, I find I have to be more nimble when I'm in an elementary classroom than when I'm in a secondary classroom. They tend to follow the path of the curriculum, like the path that the mathematics is laying out. The high school students tend to follow a little bit better, and the elementary students are, they just find other ways to get to where we're trying to get to.
Awesome, thank you. I think Patty has the next question. Gonna
Okay,
kind of
so
switch gears.
Absolutely. So this question, we're calling the reluctant student. Many categories will fall underneath that. Looking for tips and techniques to get all of our students engaged in thinking. Some categories like low and high ability students, getting them all thinking, getting them encouraged to be involved. And those students maybe that avoid being involved. What are some tips and techniques, Peter, that you can think of to help us to get everybody going?
Right. Okay. So originally when I wrote the book, I was going to have a whole section on this, but the book became too big, and maybe one day I'll write a supplement just on this as well, because we've done tons of research, right? Like all the research, and not necessarily research explicitly on these topics, but we've done research in diverse classrooms, right? Every classroom we go into is an integrated classroom now. We have students who are living with autism. We have students who are living with ADHD. We have language learners, additional language learners, so they're coming from other countries or from other home languages. We have students who have anxiety, diagnosed or otherwise. We have students who have low achievement because they haven't really learned everything the years before. We have students with egos. It's a sock drawer out there, right? Like we got it all. And you run Thinking Classroom, and I have no illusions that Thinking Classrooms, like it's not like this can of magic potion that you just open up and then it just washes knowledge over everybody and everybody interacts and engages. We still got to use all our teacherly tricks to sort of make sure that we're getting the buy-in and the engagement from all students. So how do we do this? And it fits, and the first thing to say is that I think we need to acknowledge that there are students who engage really well with Thinking Classrooms who don't necessarily engage really well with a more traditional setting. So that we tend to forget that yes, I might have a student who is resistant or having trouble here, but I need to also give myself a congratulatory pat on the back, because there's 4 students who, if I would have asked you a week ago if this is going to work, you would have said no, but they're working and it's working for them, right? So like, let's not overlook the fact that there are some really quick wins that we didn't anticipate to begin with. But now we come down to these students that we need to deal with. And I think you need to sort of locate why they're not. Okay, so is there some neurodivergence that's happening here? Is there some anxiety that's happening here? Is there some behavioral issue that's happening here? Is there some I can call it gaps, but is there some unfinished learning that's going on here? And once we identify the source of that, then the interventions are going to be very different. So for example, let's say we have a student who has high anxiety, diagnosed or not, right? So now this is a student who thrives in a traditional setting, right? Like they can hide in that 4th row, 4th desk in the 2nd row. They can just sit there and just be quiet and question. But all of a sudden they got a 7 in their hand, and they're standing there looking at this group, and they have to go and engage with these students. And that can be frightening for them. And at first, we may be surprised by which of our students spike anxiety and which don't. But nonetheless, once we identify it, one of the interventions we can do is we could say, okay, so Abby, you have okay, what card do you have? Oh, you have a 7. Okay, Abby, here's the deal. I need you, can you just go and stand like 6 feet behind your group? You don't have to say anything. You don't have to write anything. Just listen for 5 minutes and then come and tell me what they're talking about. And then Abby comes and tells me, and I'm like, oh, that sounds really interesting. I wonder what's going to happen next. Can you go find out what happens next and come and tell me, right? So our goal is to have Abby stay engaged without necessarily contributing. And every day we try to get her to be a little bit closer and to stay a little bit longer. And every time we've done this, within about 10 days, there's a perfect storm. And the perfect storm is that Abby will say something. There'll be the right combination of students, the right topic, and then Abby will say something. And it happens every time. And now the bubble is burst. And within a week, Abby is holding a marker and writing something. And what we've done is we've created an opportunity for that perfect storm to happen. That never would have happened if we allowed Abby to opt out and to do individual work in her seat or something like that. So there's an example of an intervention, but that intervention is really targeted at a specific context, let's say. Let's say we have someone else, we wanderer, right? Like every time I put him in groups, he starts drifting around the classroom. What's our intervention there? Our intervention there is, rather than alongside Don, we're like, Don, you've been wandering around. I need to know, where should I go next? What group needs my help? And Don has no idea, because he's not wandering around paying attention to everything. But it's like, okay, I don't know. It's okay, well, listen, I'm heading over to group 3. Can you keep an eye on what's going on in the room? When I finish with group 3, I want to know where I should go next. And then it's like, I come back to, he's like, oh, great, group 7 needs you. And then like by the second day, every time you look at Don, he's holding up some fingers, right? And on the 3rd day, it's like, okay, yeah, okay, thanks for letting me know group 5 needs me, but I got to head over to group 9. Any chance you can help group 5? I'm on it, right? Like elementary teachers are sitting there listening to me right now going, duh, right? Because this is what you do your whole career, right? Like it's redirect, it's classic, right? I remember I was in one classroom doing a demonstration. We were doing, I think they were grade 5s or 6s, and we were doing tax collector. And I gave them a task, I put them into groups, and one student just sat down and put his head on his arm, on the desk. So I kept working with the groups, getting them going and going and going. And eventually I went and sat down next to him. And I said, okay, what's your name? And he goes, Azim. I can't remember if it was Azim or something like that. And I go, Mr. L, do the fist pump. Like that was, Mr. L is what the kids call me. I said, what's the issue? He goes, I got a headache. I said, oh, I hate having a headache. I had a headache this morning. Headache aside, you got any ideas on the problem? He goes, yeah, I got lots of ideas. Can I have some pencil and paper? I go, no. He goes, why not? I said, you get pencil and paper all the time. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I got to go help group number 3 over there. I'll be right back. You think about it. You decide which group you want to join, and you decide whether you want to help or you want to listen. Your choice. So I head over to group 3, like within 30 seconds, he's joined a group, and I kind of saddle up next to him and I'm like, okay, I see you picked your group. Are you helping or listening? He goes, I'm helping. Right. So the teachers at the end of the day, they wanted to know, what was it I said to him? And I basically said, you can wear the red boots or the blue boots. Right. Like I made an adaptation, but what was not negotiable and what was negotiable, right? Every scenario has a different intervention. And I'm not saying they all work, and I'm not saying they're all foolproof. I'll share one more. You have a student who is just oppositional or reluctant. I think that's how you open the question, reluctant. So they're just reluctant because they can be. Okay, and we know that students will do that sometimes. They see a source, where a place where they can exercise some power, and they're reluctant. For that intervention, we run what we call the 10x2 rule, which means that for 10 days in a row, for 2 minutes a day, you're going to talk to that student about anything that has, it can be anything, but it can't have anything to do with school. So did you see the football game this weekend? Or was that your brother I saw at the mall? What's he doing these days? I haven't seen him for a while. Or it doesn't matter what it is. 2 minutes a day, 10 days in a row. And within a week, that student is not going to be reluctant anymore. And they're not going to be reluctant because we forged a relationship. But if we didn't forge a relationship with a student, that relationship is already compromised. We formed a relationship with a child. And that's why we're not allowed to talk about anything that's school related, right? Like they may be a horrible student, but you're connecting with the child rather than the student. And it works. It works. It works. So every scenario is different. So a couple of things that we've learned, and again, anybody who knows anything about classroom management isn't surprised by any of these. Redirect when you can. Come alongside rather than coming from the front, right? Like that sort of opposition that it just everyone's at their worst in that moment. So anytime you can come alongside and redirect, it's better off than meeting them with force. Try to create an opportunity for a perfect storm to occur. But wait for these things to present themselves before. I want to remind you about the 4 students that you anticipated this was going to be problematic for, who are now thriving in this. Because when we anticipate and act on our anticipation before reality has emerged, we overthink this and we overact on this, and we create scenarios that aren't necessary in order for this to keep working. I don't know if that last part made sense, but wait for the scenario to present itself before you intervene. Don't create an intervention. Don't be a solution looking for a problem.
These are some great tips. I think that we could use them in many different scenarios. Low ability, high ability, you said the same, the ones that are just avoiding being part of the task.
Yeah.
One of the questions that came up was, what about that socialized student? Do you stay after them around the room when they keep changing groups, or do you, is it back to that classroom management? We just still need to be vigilant about that.
Yeah, so you mean the student who just likes to flit around and socialize with everybody? Yeah. So again, like it's like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom, right? Like this is, again, it's about coming alongside and trying to redirect and finding a way get that student engaged. You have to understand, and I think that these questions are coming from people with real experience with this. But one of the things we have to understand is that behavior is not the source of disengagement. Behavior is a symptom of disengagement, right? A student playing on their cell phone, that's not the source of their disengagement. The cell phone is what they go to when they are disengaged. It's a symptom, not the source, right? The student who visits their friend, they're doing so because that's more interesting than what was happening in their group, right? So that the more we can engage students, the less we have issues with those sorts of behaviors. But when we do have those issues, you know, you want to try to redirect. We also want to try to be a little bit patient. Like one of the things these kids are human, just like we are. I can guarantee you that some of you who are listening right now have checked your phone. That doesn't mean you're disengaging. It means that we need to just offload our attention for a minute and then load it back on. And kids do the exact same thing. We see in the videos, the kids will pull out their cell phone, they send a quick text, phone goes back in their pocket, and they're back on. Or they lean over and they elbow their buddy in the next group, and then they're back on task, right? Like we need to stop freaking out about every one of these things, but it's, you know, if it's pervasive, then we redirect as much as we can. Right? And do not underestimate the power. And this is one of the things we learned in the COVID-19 lockdown, was just how much power teachers have through proximity. Right? And when we went online, we lost all that power. But we have tremendous power to keep the students engaged just by our presence. So we often don't need to intervene other than to just be present. Step in, step closer, the students will redirect and so on and so forth. And of course, I have not answered all of the question. What do we do with a student who's 3 grade levels behind? What do we do with a student who has some sort of authority oppositional situation? The student who lives with OCD, the student who has impulse control issues. Like we have all of these situations, and I could talk for hours about this. It's one of my favorite topics, actually.
Thank you. Don has the next question for you.
One thing I noticed in my classroom personally, and it was one of the popular topics as well in the poll, is how do you translate good group work, at the whiteboard to good individual work? I noticed that I have a number of kids who do a great job at the boards. They have great ideas. They're participating, often leading, their other group mates. And then the way it ends up working, that the next time I actually, and I have not implemented the assessment piece, next time I see their work might be when they don't do particularly well in a quiz. Yeah. So it's obviously what's missing between those two stages, and how do you eliminate that logjam?
Right. Okay. So this is a great question. I do touch on this in the book, but my work on this has actually continued a lot since the book was published. So what we're talking about is a difference between collective knowing and doing and individual knowing and doing. And this used to happen to us. We'd be in the classroom, we're watching students, we're doing a thin slicing activity, we're watching a group of students, they all got it. Everyone is doing it. They're all taking turns leading else. We're high-fiving. This is great. Nailed it. 3 days later, the teacher gives a quiz. Nope. And we're like, okay, what happened? So, okay, we go back into the classroom. We start paying more close attention. We're thinking maybe we were being a little bit too optimistic. We pay closer attention to the students, and no, for sure, they got it. Absolutely. This time, they really got it. Quiz them 2 days later. Nope. What is going on? How is this collective knowing and doing not transferring to individual knowing and doing? And before we even answer the question of the transfer piece, why is there a difference? And this is a part that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think the closest I'm coming to an answer on that right now is something that I refer to as partial understanding, right? So what we have to understand is that students don't have full understanding, right? Like full understanding, that you have a small percentage of your students who learned and mastered everything last year and remember it. Everybody else has partial understanding. Fully, it could have been last unit, right? Or they didn't fully understand it, which means that they have partial understanding. Now I want to be clear about this. This is different than what we call about gaps, or when we talk about unfinished learning and so on and so forth. It's just, we navigate life with partial understanding. We all do. Do you have full understanding of how your automobile functions? No, you don't, but you still manage to get from A to B. And if something goes wrong, you know a couple of things you can try and it might work, but you don't have full understanding, right? We don't have full understanding how our appliances work or our electronics work. We don't have full understanding on how to fill out our taxes. We recreate that knowledge every year. We operate through life on partial understanding, right? Going, and then we seek out the pieces that we're missing. And that doesn't mean that someone's standing there evaluating us with a clipboard saying, you didn't fully understand, or you don't have this knowledge. But if we just don't carry knowledge in that sort of infallible way that we strive for, right? So all students have partial understandings. Now, what happens when you put 3 students together, all who have partial understanding, is that their understandings overlap and they fill in each other. And there is a tremendous amount of communication that happens in those groups that we're not actually hearing. it's the hesitations. A student who writes a 5 when they should have written a 7, and their partner corrects them and they correct it. And then there's like, what should I do next? And then they look at someone and they say something, or they make a mistake, and then they see it, the person squints, so they fix it. There's all of this sort of continuous feedback that allows them to sort of, and as a group, navigate their way forward. And then it looks like success, right? Whereas that doesn't necessarily mean that every individual had that. What we want in a thinking classroom is, as that group finds their way forward, is that learning that is acquired within that space is then transferred to individual knowing and doing. That's the goal, right? So it's not that the group can do it and therefore the individuals can do it. It's that learning has happened as they're navigating this sea of unfinished or partial understanding, and they find their way forward. And now what we want is them to reify their learning in such a way that it organizes within their own individual mind, so that they can take that learning and that knowledge with them. Are we clear? I'm being really sort of up on my soapbox here. So nonetheless, what we found was, so that's what's going on. That's my closest approximation to what's going on. Why is it that the collective knowing and doing is different than the individual knowing and doing? Because the collective knowing and doing has all this gap filling that's built into it, right? So, but the question is, that learning happened, how do we transfer that? So when we started to notice that there were certain settings where there was greater transference from collective knowing and doing to individual knowing and doing. And the practices that were in play when that greater transference happened were the 4 practices. I call them the responsibility practices. I talk about them in chapter 15 very briefly, but the 4 responsibility practices are consolidation from the bottom, meaningful notes to my future forgetful self, check your understanding questions, and then formative assessment, or helping students understand where they are and where they're going. So these are the 4 practices that help create the transfer, and they each contribute in a different way, right? The consolidation, when the teacher consolidates at the end of the activity, what that does is it kind of creates order out of the chaos, right? It sort of straightens out that jagged learning curve that the students were doing as a group to find their way out. It kind of cuts through it in a nice straight line. It organizes it. It helps start the reifying process, right? Then the student sits down and they write some meaningful notes to themselves. Now, this is the first opportunity the student has to actually act on their own. So what is it that they learned? What is it, and the prompt we use is, what is it that happened today? What do you have to write down from today so that in 3 weeks you'll remember what happened today, right? So it's, what did you need? What did you take out of this, right? And we have to understand that notes serve 2 purposes. One is to create a record. But if that's all we want, we could just post some notes online, right? Parents will love that, by the way. The second purpose is this idea that if students writing notes creates learning. And I don't disagree with that, but it only creates learning if it's minds on, right? If they're just mindlessly copying what's on the board, that's not what we're talking about. About what it is that they want to write down. What was it that happened today? What do they want to capture? Right now we're starting that reifying process. Then there's some check your understanding questions, which is what we used to call homework, and that's basically a feedback loop, right? They're going to get some rapid feedback. Can they do individually what they did as a group, right? And then the more formal and the deeper analysis, formative assessment that happens more discreetly, really kind of helps the students know where they are and where they're going. And they're called responsibility practices because they have to start taking more responsibility for their learning, right? And the responsibility there really lives juxtaposed to accountability. Because if you think about it, the way students traditionally write notes is an accountability action. The way they normally do homework is an accountability measure. right? And then assessment is generally an accountability assessment, right? So it's what we're trying to do is we're trying to shift from students being accountable to us to being responsible for themselves. Anyway, long answer, short question. Did that help? Was there any more detail you wanted me to drill into any of those?
It did. I'd like to just follow up just a little bit. So, you know, as teachers, we want to help the students, right? And I'm 100% on board with they need to take responsibility, but right, and then they have to. Is there something that the teacher can do to sort of guide that, help that along? Because what I feel like is, you know, it's even though we discuss that with them, they don't. A lot of them don't always necessarily take that to heart. What can teachers do to sort of help that process along?
So there's some irony to this answer here. One of the things, the more I spend time thinking about this tension between accountability and responsibility, the more I become aware that you can't have both. If you make students, if you enact accountability, there will be no responsibility. So ironically, if you want to heighten responsibility, you got to give them more responsibility. But anyone who's raised a teenager knows this, right? We want them to be responsible, but the minute we take a little bit of accountability, we take a bit of the responsibility on ourselves, they give it all to us, and then everything is our fault, right? So what are some of the things we can do? Number one, we can enhance their note-taking by starting out having them write notes in groups at the whiteboard. So after the consolidation, you can say, head back to your groups, at your boards. What will your notes look like today? Right. So now that, and again, there's no anonymity in that. So they're up at the board, so they're more likely to do it. And then they can take a picture, right? And some teachers I've worked with will continue doing it that way for a very long time. Others will then say, okay, now sit down and write down what you want in your notebook. Others use that sort of group note writing as a way to really scaffold and teach these ideas. I've also worked with teachers where they run a sort of thing where every student gets 3 sticky notes. And after all the meaningful notes are up on the boards, they get to go and put their sticky notes on the notes that they find the most helpful, most meaningful. And then you start, you know, attention is drawn to those boards that have a lot of sticky notes on it. And that sort of builds this scaffolding of what makes a good meaningful note, and so on and so forth. Oh, it has an example, and it has some really clear ideas, and here's and some underlining of titles. Here's some headings. Here's some vocabulary. Here's some definitions. Here's an example. When it comes to check your understanding questions, the move that we found to be the most effective, because these are really delicate. And like I said, if we try to increase the number of students who are doing their check their understanding questions by making them handed in, we just turned this from a responsibility action to an accountability action. And then all of a sudden students are doing it, but they're doing it for the wrong reason, right? Like this one was huge. When we interviewed, we never found anything that had such a mismatch between the goals of what teachers wanted and what students wanted as homework. Like it was just absolutely massive. I was interviewing teachers and they were saying, well, I give homework because I want homework to be a safe place for students to make mistakes and learn from their mistakes. Okay, I like that. Other teachers would say, I want homework to be a place for students to see if they can do individually what they were able to do in their group. Okay, I like that, right? I want homework to be a place to check your understanding. I like that too. Interview 300 kids. Not one kid said any of those things, right? Like, why do you do homework? Not one said, well, I think homework is a safe place to make mistakes and learn from my mistakes. Not one said that. They said the number one reason they do homework is because the teacher makes me, or it's because it's for marks, the teacher makes me, or my parents make me, or my guardian makes me, right? So the minute we start making them do it, they do it for the wrong reason. So ironically, what we found was the biggest help was in your group. Here's some questions. Here's some check your understanding questions. In your group, agree as a group, which of those questions are the most important to do. And then they did. We got more students doing it. And again, what's happening here is we're giving students the responsibility and autonomy to do this. And we're increasing the number of students who are doing it by giving them more autonomy. It's ironic. And I know you're still going to have percentage of kids who don't do it. And that's the kind of stuff that white knuckles our steering wheel when we're driving home. But you got to be careful how you deal with that, because you don't want to disrupt the students who are now doing it for the right reason.
Great, thanks. We got a few questions about consolidation that were in the comments of the live stream. Tips for teachers on how to be successful with consolidation, and then there's, at least I found as well, that there are students, the students they're highly engaged while they're working on the board. I find that they sit down and they do notes, and they're really into it. But the piece in between when I'm consolidating, it's just like they were exhausted from the group work or something, and they drift off sometimes. So how can tips for teachers, and just what to say and do, and then how to keep all the kids engaged?
So the first thing I will say is consolidation. A teacher, when you do a good consolidation, you will know it and you will feel. Because I think that the most skillful thing a teacher can do in a classroom, whether it's a thinking classroom or not, is a masterful consolidation. Like, it requires just so much skill. Now, that doesn't make it impossible. It just means that if you're finding it hard, you're in good company. And if you do it well, you should celebrate that. All right. So what are some things? So to begin with, keep it short. I don't emphasize this in the book enough, and I wish I did, but it's like anything else. It's that perseverance. At the beginning, keep it short, because the students haven't built up that perseverance yet. They're tapped out after the work, right? I call there's 3 S's to a good consolidation: seeding, selecting, and sequencing. So the first one is seeding. Is there an idea that you really want to draw attention to that's not present in student work? So is there something missing that you wish was there? Did no group draw a graph? They all made tables of values, but nobody drew a graph, and you really want a graph to point at during the consolidation. Then you suggest to a group, nice table of values. What do we normally do with a table of values? Oh, we draw a graph. Hey, why don't you draw a graph, right? So this is the seeding piece, right? If there's something missing that you really believe you want to draw attention to, while you're working the room prior to consolidation, seed some ideas here and there. So that's the first one. The second one is selecting. Now that you have the work, you got to select. And selecting isn't just about selecting which ones you want. It's about locking some of these things in, because the students are erasing at a furious pace. And there's nothing worse than going, oh, this is brilliant. We're definitely going to go look at this board. And then you come over there and it's blank, or they've erased that part and they've gone on to do something else. So use your red marker, lock thing. You're selecting the boards you want to talk. And then the third one is sequencing. So now you've got some boards. What's the sequence you're going to take them through? Right? Which board are we going to look at first? Which one are we going to look at second? Which one are we going to look at third? And like I said, keep it short to begin with, but it is masterful when it's done right. And you're right, there are students who they drift away, and it can be onerous. And there's some artistry that I've seen teachers do here where they have amazing communication with students through eye contact, and students are like, I've been in classrooms where teachers are doing the consolidation, like every student's got their hand up, or they got their thumb up and they're ready to share, and so on and so forth. But we got to work on it, right?
When you say keep it short, I know in chapter 15 it has time frames. What is short?
So when you're first starting, the first tasks you do when you're building a culture of a thinking classroom, those non-curricular tasks, the first few you do should not have a consolidation at all. And then you should have a consolidation for a few minutes and maybe what you want to do is you want to draw your attention to something that everybody did, so everybody can recognize it, and then draw your attention to an unusual solution that'll make students go, right? So you're keeping it short, less than 5 minutes. And then you can extend it depending on how important the topic is and how much you feel needs to be said. but it's start off with none, work your way up through 5 minutes. I've seen teachers do a consolidation in the last 10 minutes, but it's the students to really care about what we're talking about here. And I think that the younger the students, the shorter it needs to be too. And again, this is something that we're finding as well, is that with the younger students, it needs to be shorter. That's relatively new data that's coming forward. Yeah. I have time for one more.
One of the questions that came up is about rubrics and creating them, and how do you find time to do them, and how do you make sure that you know, some people have 150 students. How do you manage all that data, you know, time-wise, as well as just what do I do with all that data?
Yeah. So, okay, so rubrics appear in 3 places in the book. Chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14. They're very different from each other. Chapter 13 and chapter 14 have a lot of overlap. I'm assuming you talk about rubrics for grading, chapter 14 here in this question. Am I correct? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So the first thing to know, I taught a whole course on this summer, actually, or last summer. I have this saying, you want to be a hunter, not a gatherer. If you walk into your classroom to gather data using one of these rubrics, you will drown in the data that comes at you. There is so much stuff that happens in a thinking classroom. There's 10 groups, they're all having conversations. So there's that group level data, there's individual student that's doing stuff. And like, oh, now Adam has the marker, I gotta pay attention to what he's doing. And now Cynthia's got the marker over here, and Akeem has a marker here, and Lee has it. And you're just running around trying to gather all this data. And the reason we're trying to do that, because as if we're a high school teacher, we think of assessment as being synchronous and collective, meaning that everyone at the same time, and we will drown in the data, right? You ask a reading, and they don't talk about synchronous, and they don't talk about everybody. They talk about 2 students today. They don't even all have to be reading the same thing, right? Like we got to get away from this view of synchronous, because we will drown in the data. So if you're a gatherer, you will drown. You got to be a hunter, which means that you wade out into all that data with a target in mind. So today, I want to pay attention to Dawn and Patty, right? Because I need some data on Dawn and Patty. That doesn't mean that if Dana happens to be doing something, I catch it out of the corner of my eye, I'm going to ignore it. But it means that I'm hunting for data from Dawn and Patty. And what that means is that I might actually put the marker in Dawn's hand so I can watch what he does with it. Or I might, after Patty has done some working with her group and she's talking to them, I might ask a specific question of Patty because I want to gather some data. So the first, rather than a gatherer, because you will drown. The second trick is you need way more data than you're used to. So we're used to having lots of data because the more data we have, the easier, the more accurate our average becomes. That's sort of this mentality that we've had for the last 100 years when it comes to grading. And that's not what we're trying to do here at all. We're not trying to have so much data that our average will be accurate. We're trying to find very targeted data so that our data tells us a story that jives with our informal observation of our students all the time, or another word for that is our professional judgment. So does that make sense? Do you want me to elaborate a little bit more there? But I think this is the biggest mistake that teachers make, and it's the biggest mistake high school teachers make, because we are, for generations, we've thought about grading at the high school level as synchronous, which means I got to get data on everybody at the same time. And we don't have to do that. Right?
I think we've come up on an hour. I know you said that you're not limiting exactly to an hour, but I think that was a really good set of questions. they were the ones that were most come up in the group, and hopefully, I know I found it fascinating listening to you. Hopefully everyone else in the group did as well. Obviously, there'll be more questions, which will never end, right? And we'll discuss them, and we're grateful for your time here. And
yeah, invite me back for more questions. I love this.
I'm sure that the group would be thrilled to have you come back another time. So we'll try to do that again.
So, the last thing I want to say on this matter is, like, don't ever forget the fact that you have a lifetime of teacherly craft that you have built up. And that teacherly craft has not been invalidated by shifting to a thinking classroom model. You still need all that teacherly craft. You need to be able to pivot and be nimble and to deal with things that go off script. You need to manage behavior, both as of the whole class and as individuals. You need to do all of these things. And we're just creating a different environment in which to do them. But don't ever underestimate your own capacity. And don't overthink this. It's like in chapter 15, I talk about the forest and the trees, right? The book is full of trees. There's 14 trees in that book and then a whole bunch of branches. But the forest is, we just want to get students thinking, right? And just keep that in mind and cut yourself some slack. I always tell teachers that the second time you do something is way better than the first, but not nearly as good as the third.
All right, well, terrific. Well, thanks again, Peter, for doing this. And we'll be in touch again. And I'm sure we'd love to have you do this another time. And again, we can't thank you enough.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
All righty, we'll see you all.